trade war, a Cold War, or even potentially a world war. Whilst many draw comparisons between the ongoing deterioration in the Chinese-American relationship to the Cold War, former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said it was closer to the events preceding World War I, with conflicting territorial claims and a power struggle that could be catastrophic. At the G7 summit in Japan, the world's 7 largest economies decided that, in light of COVID and the war in Ukraine, they should not be as reliant on China, criticising Beijing for its supposed economic coercion, with the US President Joe Biden saying he wanted to de-risk and diversify his relationship with Beijing. This is the latest in a series of tensions between the countries, including banning technology from the other side and simultaneous objectives to win the hearts and minds of the world. China's banning of American-made Micron chips for security concerns mirrors the American crackdown on Chinese tech giant Huawei, whilst the US recently bans the Chinese-originated app TikTok from government phones for similar reasons. Meanwhile, the US has signed a defense pact with Papua New Guinea amid fears of China's growing influence in Oceania and a potential invasion of Taiwan. But with 2 world superpowers wanting global domination, is the world big enough for both of them? Washington has a trade deficit of almost $400 billion with Beijing. Should their focus be on improving relations, or are they too reliant on their Chinese counterparts? What's next for the Chinese-US power struggle?
So let's get to it, gentlemen. What's next for the Chinese-U.S. power struggle? As always, we begin with our quick-fire round, 30 seconds each, to lay out your initial stats, and we pick it up from there. So, Professor Gong Jiong, 30 seconds. Please take the lead.
Well, I think the situation is not as bad as that has just been described. I don't think China and the United States are going into a war. I think there's actually some positive development recently. There's some voice in Washington saying that America's China bashing, China vilification has gone too far. And I think there's some advocacy about China and Washington and the United States to be re-engaged again in dialogues. And I think this interview with Henry Kissinger is very timely. This is precisely what he's advocating as well.
Yeah, and we'll unpack Kissinger's worldview in a split second. Mr. Bradley Bowman, your thoughts?
No, I think the world that our children and our grandchildren are going to inherit is going to be largely impacted by the state of relationships, the state of relations between the U.S. and China. And I'm hopeful that it can be resolved peacefully. There has to be enough room on this earth for both of us. There is a path forward if there's political will on both sides. But I would not say that there's been China bashing necessarily. There's been some of that. There's been an awakening in the United States regarding the nature of the adversary we confront in the Chinese Communist Party.
Last but not least, Mr. Martin Himel, your thoughts?
Well, I think Henry Kissinger, in his article comparing the eve of World War I to the situation with China and the U.S., is more headline grabbing and less an authentic look at what's going on in reality. President Xi and President Biden are not the leaders of Austria-Hungary, Serbia, and Germany, and France and Britain in 1914. They are also very aware and very responsible about their powers. They also have common interests like unparalleled trade, also with the EU and with the United States. So I think that these 2 leaders are rational and will keep things limited.
And on that note, gentlemen, please feel free to interact. And I do want to insist on Henry Kissinger's warnings, Martin Himel, because, obviously it makes a great headline, but he is suggesting that both sides are convinced that the other is humanity's greatest danger. Is there anything that can change this basic premise?
Well, I challenge the thought that they think the other side is humanity's greatest danger. I think they look at each side as a respected rival that's trying to get more hegemony, more control, more influence in the world. The United States is trying to keep its influence in Southeast Asia. It's trying to keep its business relationship and its very important chips relationship with Taiwan. It also wants to keep its trade with China, which is very, very lucrative and very, very big. So I don't think that this is going to be changed with this. Kissinger said 2 bullets, referring to the assassinations in Serbia that led to World War I. I think it would take an awful lot more than that. I think it would take an awful lot more for the Chinese leader to order an invasion of Taiwan, or for Biden to stop such an invasion. I think that they both want to stop well before that, because they got far too much to lose.
Professor Jiong.
Well, I think the political climate in Washington these days is very poisonous for a meaningful and positive U.S.-China relation discussion. You look at across the political spectrum, from left to right, from Democrats to Republicans, an overwhelming majority of them sort of put this in a lens of ideology, put this in the lens of existential competition between the United States and China, and this is not very unhealthy in my view. And I think there's very limited things that President Biden can do against the backdrop of the political development in both House and the Congress, and particularly, he is also politically handicapped for his economic policy domestically. So I don't think he's going to spend any more capital in negotiating with the Congress to move further with the China-U.S. relationship. I'm not very hopeful of that.
Mr. Bowman, what's the view from Washington on that?
Yeah, I think respectfully, the professor is fundamentally misreading what's going on in Washington. It's interesting that all of the diagnosis there is putting all the blame on the United States. Anyone who's been in a marriage or been in a friendship understands it usually takes 2 to tango. The reason this relationship is somewhat acute right now is primarily because of the situation in Taiwan. Why is that? It's because the Chinese Communist Party has refused to take military force off the table. Beijing could de-escalate the tensions right now by saying we have no intention of conducting a military attack or invasion of Taiwan. Period. The United States is not going to start a war with China. We don't want that. That would be bad for everyone, for the United States and China. If there's going to be military conflict in the short term, almost certainly it's going to arise in the context of Taiwan. And why is that? That's because Beijing is threatening to attack. And we're saying, don't attack, let's resolve it diplomatically. So the good people on both sides argument just doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
Well, can I respond to that?
Of course, Professor Jiong.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Chinese government has put aside the use of force for the last 40 years. If you look at China's Taiwan policy, it has been, overwhelmingly peaceful. We attracted 250,000 businessmen from Taiwan. We have tried to integrate the two sides' economy. We have offered all kinds of favorable policies towards the Taiwanese. But the problem is that there is inherently an independence movement in Taiwan, which is very much encouraged by Washington, or at least connived by Washington. So I think, without the use of force as a last resort, as at least, a declaration of potential use of force as a last resort, Taiwan would have declared independence tomorrow. So I think this idea that the mainland side should put aside this use of force issue away and expectations. Somehow people over there would settle their disagreement with the mainland China. It's just a pipe dream. So I think it's basically what's happening in Taiwan is that it's a whole government approach, it's a whole society approach towards Taiwan independence. And Taiwan independence is not just a sort of a ceremonial event, it's a process, it's a political process going on right now, every minute, every day, every year. So this is the context, and I think Washington, by further supporting this, is actually adding fuel to the fire, in my view.
Mr. Bowman, I can see you shaking your head.
No, I welcome the friendly, constructive dialogue here. The problem is there are 2 or 3 factual errors in what the professor just said. One is the reason China has not taken Taiwan by force in the past for the last 40 years is because they lack the military means to do it, because of American military power, period. Anything else is just rhetoric. And what is changing is that the balance of military power between the U.S. and China is changing. China is undertaking the largest military modernization effort in the history of the People's Republic of China. And anyone who's been half awake and watching their military exercises around Taiwan, those are incredibly aggressive, incredibly provocative. So I love this win-win, we're good for everyone rhetoric, but it's just dramatically dissonant from the actions that you see the People's Liberation Army taking in the Taiwan Strait. So it really is kind of a wolf in sheep's clothing here. And to say that we want to help 25 to 26 million people in Taiwan breathe free, unlike what Beijing's done in Hong Kong, and you're somehow going to make Washington the villain here, I don't really understand that logic chain.
If I may interject, the thing is, though, while there is very heavy military firepower between the United States and China, the leaders themselves, I think, have internalized to a great degree that they're not going to cross a certain line because it'll be mutual disaster, if not mutually assured destruction, if they go to the route to Taiwan. So yes, there's a lot of muscle flexing, there's a lot of posturing, there's rearmament, but the rules are basically the same. And I don't see that changing in the long term because China has so much to lose economically, socially, and in many ways. It doesn't want to become Russia. They saw what happened with Ukraine. They don't want that to happen to them. And so I don't see them crossing a certain line, and I don't think the United States wants to go on the offensive either because of the same reasons.
So not crossing a line, but I'm finding it difficult to mend the gaps here. How can they both try to improve relations, Biden talking about the need of a hotline, etc., and want to beat one another at the very same time? Is it all a facade?
It's not facade. It's a way of managing the conflict. It's a way of managing the disagreement. It's a way of keeping it peaceful, even with all the threats that are implicit with it.
So keep it peaceful, but my pistol is on the table.
Yes.
Okay, Professor Jiong, final remarks before we take a short break?
Well, I want to make a point that the Taiwan issue has nothing to do with sort of democratic value, these sort of things. It's an issue first and foremost and absolutely about sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is an issue sort of as a legacy issue lingering from the civil war in China. Before that, Taiwan was part of China. So this has nothing to do with democracy and all these things. And I think, to expect that the logic that China hasn't taken actions because of some military inferiority compared to the United States is totally wrong. China would take actions regardless of the military situation in Taiwan.
Democracy and its nonsense, right? Professor Gong Jiong, Mr. Bradley Bowman, and Martin Himel, you're staying with us. A quick break, and we discuss World War Chip. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Professor Gong Jiong, Mr. Bradley Bowman, and Martin Himel. Thank you, gentlemen, so very much for staying with us. We're also, of course, staying on topic, but before we get back to our conversation, it's the economy, stupid, right? It always is. So let's take a quick listen to U.S. President Joe Biden and pick it up from there.
We're also united in our approach to the People's Republic of China. And the joint statement released yesterday outlines the shared principles we've all agreed to at the G7 and beyond in dealing with China. We're not looking to decouple from China. We're looking to de-risk and diversify our relationship with China. That means taking steps to diversify our supply chains, and we're not dependent on any one country for necessary products.
So let's get to it, gentlemen. Another quick fire, around 30 seconds each. With a trade deficit of almost $400 billion with Beijing, is Washington too reliant on China, economically, that is? Mr. Bowman, please take the lead.
Yeah, no, I think the United States government has a spending problem. I can here in a free democracy, which is something I can criticize my government, and I would say we spend too much. We have a deficit problem and we have a debt problem, and that debt problem creates vulnerabilities, and it ultimately has national security implications. And so I believe we need to move toward a balanced budget while prioritizing national defense.
Yeah, so not a China problem, but a spending problem. Martin Himel.
Well, the very fact that the United States has a $400 billion deficit with China is your big answer why there'll be no military conflict. The United States and China have very strong economic ties. It's in China's favor right now, but the United States needs what it's taking from China. Otherwise, that trade wouldn't be happening. I understand why Biden wants to diversify. He wants political leverage with China, and he's trying to lower the dependence. But they are dependent. And that's the major reason why we're not going to see a situation of warfare soon.
Last but not least, Professor Gong Jiong, your thoughts?
Well, the very reason that America spends so much is precisely because they're spending on defense. The history of American debt is essentially a history of American war. If you look at the wars that have taken place in the United States, it's astonishing that only like 16 years out of 200 years you have peace out there. Now, regarding this $400 billion surplus from China's perspective, it's actually a little bit overestimation in my view. First of all, it's a trade surplus associated trading goods. United States enjoys a trade surplus in service. Another thing is that, we should be talking about value added from trade, not the trade amount. I mean, Donald Trump used to say, China makes $400 billion. China didn't make $500 billion. A lot of it is actually made by corporate America operating in China.
Okay, on that note, gentlemen, interesting. Let's please feel free to interact. I do want us to address the chip in the room, if you will. Is China's bid to de-Americanize the chip industry going to backfire, Mr. Bowman?
The bottom line is the United States cannot rely on technology to defend itself that originates in China, obviously. And obviously China recognizes that principle because if you look at the news in the last 24 hours about Micron technology. So it's kind of an obvious thing. I mean, one of the things that has happened is we've had the largest transfer of intellectual property in human history from the United States to China. Some of that has been acquired licitly, some has been acquired illicitly. But the bottom line is we don't want American and Western technology being used against our troops in the Taiwan Strait in 2027. So it's kind of an obvious national security step. And I'll be interested to see whether the professor criticizes that because we see China adopting the very same policy.
Professor?
Well, I think the biggest intellectual property transfer happened actually during the 19th century from United Kingdom to United States, mostly during the Industrial Revolution in the textile industries. The technologies are almost exclusively acquired illicitly, okay? I think that narrative is totally wrong. United States used to be at the other side of the table. Now, of course, the other way around. There's a good comparison between Micron technology and Huawei. There's a lot of misunderstanding to what happened to Micron right now. Micron's most of its business is actually selling chips to the handset manufacturers. That business is not affected at all in China. I mean, it can still sell memory chips to manufacturers in China. What's being affected is it sells to server farm chips. In other words, this is part of the national information infrastructure. It concerns national security. Exactly the same kind of argument the United States government invokes on Huawei. But on the other hand, Huawei's handset business is also banned as well, as you know it. So I think this is a good comparison. It's actually a fairly accurate comparison that speaks volume about two governments' respective attitudes towards the other side's company.
Yeah, and Martin Himel, if we know anything from geopolitics here in the Middle East, but all around the world, nothing brings two enemies closer rather than a mutual enemy. Question being, is AI at least have the potential of bringing China and the U.S. closer, or is it going to be weaponized first?
Well, I think AI and the chip industry all fall into a very interesting trend that's hitting the world lately. We all thought that with advanced tech progress like the chip making, social media, the internet, the world's going to become one global village. Well, it's far from it. Our tribal instincts and our instinct to preserve ourselves and defend ourselves is certainly overcoming the idea of sharing knowledge all across the world. And what's happening in China and the United States is a very classic case in point. That's why TikTok is being banned in certain areas in the United States, even though they claim they're not a Chinese company. well, that remains to be seen. But the important thing here is that I think just like with this technology, there'll be guarded exchange and efforts to preserve it under national borders. I think with AI, there'll be a similar process. At the very cutting edge, the United States will try to keep whatever its progress is firmly in American hands. I think the Chinese will try to do the same, and we'll have to take it from there. I think that the big fear of AI is that if AI becomes the fighter and the decision maker in warfare, that's what Henry Kissinger was talking about. Human beings long ago do not have given up the decision making in warfare to machines. Yeah. When missiles are fired, it's not a human being that fires an anti-missile. It's a machine, because we can't react fast enough. And similarly on the offensive, machines are deciding on a tactical level when to fire missiles, when to not at certain times. And so AI raises that possibility exponentially. And the big fear is that the AI will make the decisions and not human beings. And that's something we do have to carefully consider.
Mr. Bowman.
Yeah, no, I hope the viewers were listening carefully and noticed that the professor, when I was making the point about technology, referred to 19th century English textiles. So you know you're winning an argument when someone brings up 19th century English textiles. But the other point I would make is that everything he's saying, he's trying to create a moral equivalence where it's not justified. China has it. Don't take my word for it. Read their doctrine of military-civil fusion. The whole purpose is to break down the barriers between the military and the commercial. So China presents a civilian and commercial front for the purpose of acquiring technology to create national champion companies, to put Israeli, American, European companies out of business, and to siphon technology to the People's Liberation Army. It's an explicit doctrine. Here's another thing the professor won't like. There is no such thing as a Chinese private company. They're already working for the Chinese Communist Party, or they're one phone call away from the Chinese Communist Party. You don't like that? Answer this question. Is there any company based in China that will say no to the Chinese Communist Party when they call? Professor, you know the answer. I know the answer. You cannot create a moral equivalence between a company operating in China and Microsoft.
Professor, wrap it up for us.
Well, this is an argument that's being used a lot against Chinese companies. I think we should have to, read carefully what the Huawei CEO has said previously. He said that he will never do anything to hurt his customers. I think that's a very resounding answer to the question that was raised. So I think, in that regard, this sort of broad washing and sort of vilifying Chinese companies is totally unfair. American companies are subject to the same kind of pressure from FBI, from CIA as well. I mean, don't tell me that all of them are innocent.
Total false equivalence. Absolutely false.